A boy and a girl, no older than 10, are paraded in front of the statues of the gods. Their faces look almost serene, their skin is unblemished. Their clothes are of the finest cloth, emblazoned with gold, silver, and gleaming seashells. The pair are laid down at the sacrificial site, splayed upon a large slab of stone, held by their shoulders and legs by the priests. Deep incisions are made in their chests. They howl out in pain, but the priests keep cutting until the children finally fall unconscious from blood loss and shock. Their hearts are taken out and held aloft to the gods. Witnesses dance and cheer as the priests smear the statues with the children's blood. Now that doesn't sound like a great way to go, huh? It's thought that this is what happened to quite a few children in the mid-1400s in what is now known as the country of Peru, back then the Chimu state. Archaeologists dug up 137 boys and girls in a mass grave, and what they discovered is that many of the bodies had been damaged in a way that looked like the kids had died healthy, but at the time of death had suffered horrendously. They'd been opened up and their ribs had been displaced, which led the experts to believe that their sacrifice involved their hearts being pulled out, Indiana Jones style. This kind of thing didn't just go on in Chimu State. There's plenty of evidence that human sacrifice happened in the Maya culture, the Aztec culture, the Inca culture, and other cultures that existed south of the US border. Let's take the Incas for example. Since they didn't write anything down, how do we know they slaughtered children in the name of their gods? Well, burial sites have been found, and the Spanish wrote something about sacrifices back in the day when they were expanding their empire. It's believed that in some cultures, children were chosen for their perfect looks. It made them seem untouched, pure. They might be a boy or a girl from the age of 6 to 15. For the months prior to their execution, they would be fed well and treated well because, hey, you don't give the gods damaged goods. Children were often chosen just for that reason. They had purity that adults didn't. That was the rationale anyway. For instance, if the Mayans sacrificed prisoners of war, they only did it with their high-ranking soldiers. Those from lower ranks became slaves, a much worse fate in the eyes of their captors. You didn't sacrifice just anyone when you were trying to placate those mighty and sometimes furious gods that you relied on to protect you. Before the children were sacrificed, they might meet the emperor and feasts would be held in their honor. They were treated like royalty and would be dressed in the finest clothes available at the time, while also having their bodies decorated with jewels and ornaments. Still, the ending was hardly a happy one. In the Inca culture, the children would be marched up a mountain in horrific conditions, fed coca leaves to keep them going, and then before they were killed, they'd be given some kind of drug that would at least take the edge off their fear and pain. One of the mummies that archaeologists found had his feet and hands tied, so we guess the cocktail didn't work too well that time. In the case of the Incas, the kids were usually then strangled or hit over the head. In other cultures, there was heart extraction, head removal, flaying of the skin, and it might end with the children being eaten, sometimes by their own parents. If we look at the Aztecs, for them being part of a sacrificial rite was supposed to be an honor. The gift to the gods had to look as though they were pleased about it, and if the victim screamed and cried, it was an insult to the gods. They'd still die, but would die in shame while being chastised. It couldn't have been easy trying to look like you were okay with the whole ceremony. Imagine being sacrificed to an Aztec god. First, a priest would take a sacrificial knife and sometimes drive it into the abdomen, and from there he'd cut through the diaphragm. The heart, which was thought of as part of the sun, would then be placed into a bowl that was held by something called an achmul, a statue sitting down looking to the side like it had just been interrupted while doing a sit-up. The dead body would then be ceremoniously thrown down the temple stairs. All while this was going on, there would be music, dancing, and a little bit of self-harm in the form of piercing. Blood would be flying all around as the merriment continued. Later, the body would be thrown to the animals and sometimes eaten by humans. Not the head though, no one got to eat the head. That would be kept on something called the zompantli, aka skull rack. We're being reductive here because this kind of thing went on in many places over hundreds of years, and the manner of sacrifice and the reason for the sacrifice could be very different. One thing for certain was that there would almost always be gods involved. If you could appease the gods were nice to you, and if they were kind, you got good harvests. It rained, it didn't flood, you won wars, you didn't suffer from climate change or disease. Back to the Maya and their rituals. What would often happen first was bloodletting. That would entail using a very sharp object such as a stingray spine. With that, part of the person's body would be pierced, maybe the fingers, maybe the ears, and maybe the male sex organ. That person would then be laid down at an altar and amateur surgery would take place, usually starting with something called a median sternotomy. That's not what the Mayans called it, of course, but that's the term we use today. It starts with an incision down the sternum, which is then cracked open so there's access to the heart. They would either get to the heart through the sternum or through the diaphragm down below the ribs, and it would be cut out. You're probably wondering at which point the person died. Well, they would very likely be alive and kicking during the initial incision, and that's how people survive open-heart surgery, but once their bodies were further exploited, that would be it. However long they lasted, we think human sacrifice deserves to be on the list of worst ways to die. But heart extraction was only one form of sacrifice in pre-Columbian America. There was much more. Sometimes a person would be buried in a tomb with the dead, which was a sign of respect. It wasn't bloody, but it very likely got lonely. The person would die of dehydration if they didn't die from suffocation. If there was famine or drought, the Mayans might throw people into what's known as a cenote, which is kind of a sinkhole. There's also evidence that the Mayans sometimes tied a person's head behind his neck and then disemboweled them. In ancient Mexico and Central America, there's some evidence that people were flayed and their skin would be used in a dancing ceremony, while at other times people would simply be burned. What about more modern human sacrifice? Well, there isn't much of it going on these days. In the 19th century, the Pawnee Native Americans had something called the Morning Star ceremony. This consisted of a captured young woman being tied to a scaffold. Her captors would then ride past her on horses while burning her armpits and groin with torches, after which she would be touched with war clubs by other men. A sacred arrow would be shot into her heart and she'd be hit over the head with the club. Her chest would be cut, but it was just a small cut to allow the blood to flow. Her heart would remain where it was. After all this, male members of the tribe would fill her body with arrows. This shooting of arrows was supposed to represent the men copulating with her, and the blood that dripped represented fertility for plants and animal life. The last time this happened was 1838. Archaeologists have discovered burial sites of the sacrificed in China, Rome, Greece, and Egypt, and there's some evidence that human sacrifices took place in the Middle East, Africa, and ancient and prehistoric Europe. In fact, from what we can see, human sacrifices might have taken place at one point in time all over the world. Scientists don't always agree, only because very old bones aren't always easy to understand. Now go watch What Happens to You Just Before You Die, or have a look at this.